The United States is a country of endless war. There's really no denying that. In our lifetimes, the United States has been in constant warfare. The only exception was supposed to be this decade under the Clinton administration and the first Bush administration, when we were told with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, we would receive all the benefits of the peace dividend. And yet that didn't happen. The defense budgets continue to increase under President Clinton and then the first Bush presidency. Both of those presidents found all sorts of reasons to go to war, including back with Saddam Hussein, as well as with in Yugoslavia, the war in which we intervened there, and all sorts of other smaller wars that continuously justified this increasing defense budget. And then right away, when the second George Bush was elected, who ran on a platform of ushering in a more humble foreign policy, one that involved less and less war, the 9/11 attack happened 9 months after his inauguration, and all the people who had long wanted to march into Iraq to change the government of that country for some reason used the 9/11 attack as a pretext to do so, and the United States was at war for the next 20 years. And when finally that war ended with the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, where, as you probably recall, Joe Biden incinerated a family of 10 innocent people with a drone on his way out for good measure, virtually 6 months later, not even, the U.S. had a brand new war, an endless war, one that's incredibly expensive to fight and that feeds the arms industry, which is the war in Ukraine. One of the only things that ties together all of those wars, beyond the fact that it's the CIA that expands in authority and budgets and that the arms industry profits greatly at the expense of the American taxpayer, it's a massive transfer of wealth from the American taxpayer to the arms industry. One of the few commonalities among all those wars, going back in fact to the Cold War with things like the war in Vietnam, is the justification is always the same. The propagandistic framework offered by the US government through the corporate media and its allies in the corporate media never changes. The argument always is that these wars are not only necessary for national security, but morally justified. And the reason they're morally justified is because the United States believes in democracy and wants to defend people and liberate them from despotism and ensure that they enjoy the fruits of democratic life the way we in the United States enjoy it. Now, obviously, one immediate question is, why is that the role of the United States government, to go around the world changing the governments of other countries to bring a form of democracy or a form of government that they may or may not want? That was the justification offered for the horrific and decade-plus war in Vietnam that ended the life of almost 60,000 American soldiers who died in the jungles of Vietnam and millions of Vietnamese civilians as well. We were told that we were there to bring democracy to the people of Vietnam, to ensure that they were not subject to despotism, even though the South Vietnamese government, who was our ally, was anything but democratic. They were incredibly autocratic. And historians almost unanimously will acknowledge the fact that the vast majority, or the majority at least, of people in Vietnam wanted and preferred the rule of Ho Chi Minh to the South Vietnamese autocrats that we were trying to impose on them. So even if you did believe that it was somehow the duty of the US government to sacrifice the lives of its citizens and to spend billions of dollars to change the government of Vietnam all the way on the other side of the world, and find it so threatening that one small country in Asia wanted an experiment with communism or whatever form of government they decided they wanted to try, even if you believe that it was the role of the US government, the foundational claim never made sense, because our allies that we were fighting with and whom we were defending were anything but democratic. And that was, of course, the same argument used for Iraq. We were going to liberate the Iraqi people from the evils of Saddam Hussein, who had long been a partner himself of the United States. We were told that about Libya, and the reason we needed to engage in a regime change war there to free the Libyan people from Muammar Gaddafi, even though the idea that Democrats were going to take over Libya and rule it like some Jeffersonian republic was preposterous, but that was the justification given then as well. The same justification was given for the CIA covert regime change war in Syria, where we were fighting on the side of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, trying to change the government of Syria, and yet we were constantly told we were bringing democracy to the Syrian people, even though Assad, like Gaddafi, had long been a US ally. It was the claim in Afghanistan. You probably remember that Laura Bush in 2001, George Bush's wife, wrote an article, an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times claiming that we had to go and fight the Taliban in Afghanistan because we needed to go and defend women's rights in Afghanistan. This is always the argument. The neocons wanted to go into Iran, change the government of Iran. We were told the same thing there. We were bringing democracy to the Iranian people. And now this is the argument that is constantly invoked by Joe Biden about the war in Ukraine, because a population wants to feel good about the wars its money is being used to prosecute. People want to know and think that the wars that they are now a part of and that their government is helping to fuel has some righteous cause, has some just cause, specifically that we're trying to free the world, bring democracy everywhere. Even though at the very same time, many of the world's most repressive and despotic regimes, such as the one in Saudi Arabia, such as the one in Egypt, and many others, are among our closest allies, the closest allies of the US government. Somehow, Joe Biden, and before him, Trump and Obama, and then before him, George Bush, can pick up the phone and send huge amounts of money and troops or weapons to the most despotic regimes in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and the next minute look into the camera and say, we are fighting these wars for democracy. Trump was the only president who never pretended that, which is one of the reasons why he was so hated. He refused that propagandistic framework. He said, why should the role of the United States government be to control other governments around the world? We should be focused and set on the lives of our own people and let those governments and their people in those countries take care of who their own governments are. But every other president was required and eagerly affirmed the propagandistic framework that the reason we go to war is to help liberate people around the world. As preposterous as it is, that is what ends up helping to sell each and every new war. And that is exactly the argument being invoked and has been invoked from the beginning by Joe Biden to justify what now seems to be this endless proxy war in Ukraine. Here on March 1st, 2022, just a week or so after Russia first invaded Ukraine and Joe Biden wanted to side with the Ukrainians and send arms, he cast it, as you see on the screen, as the, quote, battle between democracy and autocracy. That was the phrase from his State of the Union speech, his first one. He was so excited to have a new war, and he was able to justify this new war on the grounds that we were fighting for democracy. Quote, President Biden says Putin, quote, will pay even more for Ukraine invasion, but mentions no other foreign policy priorities. That was the only foreign policy priority that he mentioned in that State of the Union address, and it was justified on the grounds that we were there to side with democracy in the war against autocracy. Now, as I said, that has always been a very difficult claim to maintain, given that Vladimir Zelensky is anything but an avatar of democracy. He has a long line, as we're about to show you, of despotic actions, including some that took place well before the Russian invasion. But that despotic posture has achieved all new heights when he just announced this week that there would be no elections in this beautiful and lovely democracy that we are defending in Ukraine until this war is finally concluded, whenever that might be, 2025, 2029, 2032. He is the president indefinitely without any democratic mandate for as long as this war goes on. Listen to what he said.
Наступного року вибори.
Це ж питання глобальне. І якщо ми переможемо, то будуть. Значить, не буде військового часу, не буде війни. А вибори повинні проходити у мирний час, коли немає війни, згідно законодавства. І тому це так.
So for those listening in the podcast form who didn't see the subtitles, he's essentially saying Ukraine is under martial law. Elections are things that happen only in peacetime. Because Ukraine is at war, there will be no elections. And there will be no elections until that war is concluded. Now, I've seen already, of course, many people defending Zelensky's decision to cancel all elections, or in other words, to kill Ukrainian democracy as a means of saving it, on the grounds that, of course, when a nation is at war, you can't have elections. But look at the history of the United States, which fought a civil war, a devastating civil war that killed a lot more people than the war in Ukraine is killing. that destabilized the United States greatly, and we still had elections. Look at both world wars, including World War II, where the United States was attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. We didn't cancel any elections. We didn't have presidents declaring themselves indefinitely in power on the grounds that we're under martial law and we can't have elections while we're at war, only in peacetime. After 9/11, when the country was attacked and its major institutions of power targeted and 3,000 Americans were killed, we still had our midterm elections the following year, just about a year later. Nobody ever suggested that we should cancel elections, except for one person. It was the only instance I can recall of a major politician suggesting that wartime should result in the cancellation of elections. And as soon as he said it, everyone from across the political spectrum, including his own party, denounced it. That was Rudy Giuliani, who was mayor, famously, of New York when the 9/11 attacks took place. And 2 weeks later, a little bit more than 2 weeks later, here you see the CNN headline, Giuliani wants to delay his departure as mayor. He was already term limited out of office. There was an election scheduled, and he wanted to delay that election on the grounds that the United States is now at war. Quote, New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani's plan to delay his successor's inauguration was designed to please both sides in the debate over whether he should stay on as mayor after his term runs out, he said Friday. While he doesn't support changing the term limits law that bar him from serving his third consecutive term, Giuliani said the month and a half between Election Day and the inauguration is simply not long enough for a new mayor to slide into the role during this troubled period. Quote, when I became mayor, I thought the transition period I had was too short, a month and a half. And at that time, I was facing a fiscal crisis, not the kind of crisis they have now, he told the syndicated radio program I Miss in the Morning. Under the best of circumstances, it takes about 3 to 4 months to really get government started, he said. Now, the fact that he just invented out of whole cloth some new rule that he wanted to impose that had no basis in the law, that the period between the election and the inauguration was too short, and that in particular it's far too short during wartime, even when the World Trade Center was still in rumble, and Americans were very traumatized by the 9/11 attack. I lived in New York at this time. I remember how deeply affected, especially residents of New York City were. The whiff of those bodies underneath the rubble stayed in the air for at least a week, if not longer. Everywhere you went for a month or 2 months, there were signs at every corner. Oh, so many signs, packing and covering every street post of faces of people who were quote unquote missing, posted by their desperate family members, hoping against hope that they weren't dead beneath the rubble, but instead were somehow lost or in a hospital somewhere. It was definitely, in terms of a public event, the most traumatizing that Americans have faced in this lifetime. Probably nothing compares to it other than Pearl Harbor. And yet, Rudy Giuliani's suggestion was instantly mauled as completely undemocratic. And so Zelensky tried suggesting that this is somehow some sort of widely recognized rule that in wartime you postpone elections. Even in the UK and in countries that were being bombed and occupied by the Nazis during World War II, elections often continued. Now, if this were a unique, isolated circumstance, one might say, well, maybe Zelensky was speaking impetuously or prematurely or with emotion. But this is a long history of despotic behavior and authoritarian gestures that he is responsible for that makes it clear that he has this despotic posture, while the United States insists over and over that we're there to fight and defend democracy. In December of 2022, as Reuters reported, Ukraine was preparing a law that would allow the government under Zelensky to ban affiliated churches of the Russian Orthodox Church, the oldest church in that region, the oldest church in Ukraine, which many Ukrainians, 43 million in fact, considered themselves members of. He wanted to shut down churches based solely on his unilateral and unreviewable decree that those churches somehow were affiliated with Russia, usually because they speak Russian in their services. That is not a very democratic mentality, one that seeks to close old churches to which many people in that country have allegiance on the grounds that somehow they are disloyal to the government with no trial, just a decree. In March of 2022, just a week after the Russian invasion, there you see from The Guardian, Zelensky suspended 11 political parties that he claims have ties to Russia. Quote, Ukraine suspends 11 political parties with links to Russia. The country's National Security and Defense Council took the decision to ban the parties from any political activity. Most of the parties affected were small, but one of them, the opposition Platform for Life, has 44 seats in the 450-seat Ukrainian parliament. In other words, a party that has 10% of the representation in Congress was banned, just banned, shut, prohibited, made illegal by presidential decree. Quote, the activities of those politicians aimed at division or collusion will not succeed, but will receive a harsh response, Zelensky said in a video address on Sunday. Therefore, the National Security and Defense Council decided, given the full-scale war unleashed by Russia and the political ties that a number of political structures have with the state, to suspend any activity of a number of political parties for the period of martial law, the Ukrainian leader added. Now, even if you want to defend full-scale martial law during wartime, which if you do, it's pretty difficult to simultaneously maintain that we're there because we're fighting for democracy. That's always been the question since the start of this war. What is the United States' interest in this war? Why are we spending tens of billions and hundreds of billions of dollars depleting our own weapon stockpile, risking escalation and even nuclear war, getting to the point that even Joe Biden says we're at the closest point to nuclear annihilation since at any moment since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis? What is the reason, the motive, the interest for the United States to be this involved in this war and continuously fuel it, and not just fuel it, but according to the then Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, affirmatively blocking any attempts at diplomacy to resolve the war as though we want it to continue, which is clearly the case when it comes to the US government and the British government. So the question has always been, what is the reason? And so they have to give a reason. And the reason has been because we're there to fight democracy at the same time that Zelensky is canceling elections, closing churches, and banning opposition parties. So if you're inclined to defend that on the grounds that there's a war, take note of the fact that in February of 2021, more than a year prior to the Russian invasion, before the Russian invasion, as you see from the German news outlet Deutsche Welle, the Ukrainian government banned TV stations that it claimed were pro-Russian. We can put that headline on the screen. Ukraine bans pro-Russian TV stations, and the article read, again, this is 2021, February of 2021, more than a year before the Russian invasion. Quote, 3 pro-Russian TV channels have gone off the air in Kiev after pro-Western President Vladimir Zelensky signed a Ukrainian Security Council decree imposing sanctions for 5 years on 8 media and TV companies. The Kiev stations affected were Zik, News One, and 112 Ukraine. Their broadcasts were only available Tuesday night via the video hosting platform YouTube, reported the Russian news agency TASS. It identified the channel's owner as Taras Kozak, a lawmaker and member of the pro-Russian opposition Platform for Life party, quoting him as describing Zelensky's move as a, quote, act of blatant censorship. That is what that is, right? By definition, it's an act of blatant censorship. Then we have this NPR report from July of 2022. Headline, Zelensky has consolidated Ukraine's TV outlets and dissolved rival political parties. So he has complete control over the media in Ukraine. He shut down all the opposition parties, all the opposition TV outlets, all the ones that were critics of his government, and shut down key rival political parties. He has full authoritarian, totalitarian control over that government, over that country. This is the country, the government we're told we're defending in order to save democracy. Here's what that NPR report said, quote, President Zelensky has consolidated all TV platforms in Ukraine into one state broadcast and restricted political rivals. Political opponents fear such civil liberty constraints could continue. Now, again, if you want to justify the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine on some kind of national security ground, which honestly I can't conceive of what it would be, I believe the real reason that there is so much bipartisan support within the establishment wings of both political parties, which there absolutely is yet again. We're always told how the two parties can never get along, how they're at each other's throats, how they're so radically different. And yet time after time after time after time on the most critical foreign policy questions and questions of imperialism and war, the two parties completely coalesce and align. Nancy Pelosi and AOC have exactly the same view as Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham. The only dissent one finds within the American political establishment is a few dozen members of Congress and the Senate from the Republican Party who are generally more aligned with the populist right wing of the Republican Party. Josh Hawley and Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene. There were roughly 70 votes against the $40 billion authorization that the Congress approved in May of last year. Every single Democrat voted yes. The overwhelming majority of the Republican establishment voted yes. And the question becomes, what is the reason? Why is this happening? What is their goal? And my belief is that the reason Republican establishment figures like Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio are so supportive of Joe Biden's war policy in Ukraine is because that pro-war wing of the Republican Party is reflexively jingoistic. By which I mean every time there's a proposed war that the United States might fight and identify some bad foreign enemy that we're supposed to go to war with, every single time, that wing of the Republican Party, the establishment wing of the Republican Party, automatically wants to go to war, bomb those countries, kill people, remove their governments. Every single war of the last 20 years that has been proposed to fight or that the United States did fight, Lindsey Graham was a cheerleader for. Whether there's a Democrat or Republican president, doesn't matter. To the extent he's critical, it's always on the grounds that we should be escalating the war even further. But otherwise, he's very supportive of the war itself, like the Republican Party is in general. And that's the reason I believe they are, is because they just immediately, reflexively see the world as the United States being so inherently good that anything it does, including bombing other countries, killing other people, invading other countries, changing governments, coupping governments, is intrinsically a positive. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.